Even as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt delivered his Day of Infamy speech to Congress after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, U.S. forces were already engaged in combat against the Japanese on Luzon Island in the Philippines. It was the beginning of the first two ground battles of World War II, Bataan and Corregidor. The soldiers who fought those battles bought the U.S. precious time to prepare our Pacific defenses, and time to repair the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor. The achievements of those soldiers are often forgotten in the wake of Midway, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. This is the story of the United States Army's Philippine Scouts. As a result of the Spanish-American War, the United States acquired a new colony, the Philippine Islands. But an insurrection quickly developed, led by independence-minded Filipinos. To defeat the insurrection, General Arthur MacArthur, father of famous World War II General Douglas MacArthur, organized the U.S. Army's Philippine Scouts.
The Philippine Scouts were made members of the U.S. Army following the Spanish-American War in an effort to try to bring about peace in the Philippine Islands.
To ensure peace, Arthur MacArthur had the U.S. Army build new roads and public schools throughout the islands so Filipino farmers could get their crops to market, and every child could have a free education. The Philippine Scouts' enlisted soldiers were Filipinos, and the officers were Americans. It was a distinct honor for a U.S. Army officer to serve in the Philippine Scouts.
Philippine Scouts were outstanding soldiers. They were excellent marksmen. They were at home in the jungles or in the mountains or any other rough terrain. They were dedicated to doing their jobs and doing them well.
I was a recruit, 6 months on a bare horse, no saddle at all. After the horse riding, then we start having dismounted drill.
I was senior in college when I saw the newspapers that Japan and the United States are about to clash each other, you know. So before we were drafted, we went to join the U.S. Army. We train every night on horseback, dismounted. We go on maneuvers even at night, extended training.
The Philippine Division included 3 infantry regiments and a field artillery regiment, and combat support troops such as medics and engineers. Philippine Scouts manned the coastal artillery batteries on Corregidor Island that guarded the mouth of Manila Bay. And the U.S. Army based its last horse-mounted cavalry regiment, the 26th Cavalry Philippine Scouts, at Fort Stotsenburg, north of Manila. During the 1920s and 1930s, the Inspector General rated the Philippine Scouts the most efficient combat unit in the United States Army. In 1935, the United States Congress voted to make the Philippines an independent country, effective July 4, 1946. Philippine President Manuel Quezon had to create a national army for the Philippines to defend the islands in case of attack once the U.S. withdrew. He hired an old friend, General Douglas MacArthur, to build the new Philippine Army to an authorized strength of 200,000 men. The Philippine Army would have 20 times as many soldiers as the U.S. Army's Philippine Scouts.
Unfortunately, they never quite got the results they expected. The Philippine legislature, for one reason or another, was either unable or unwilling to appropriate enough money to fill out the training program the way MacArthur expected it to work. And by the time we get to 1941 or 42, we have a Philippine Army that only has about half the number of men in it that it's supposed to have sent through the training program up to that point. A lot of the infantrymen didn't have rifles. There were artillerymen who had never even seen a cannon. Uniforms were in short supply. Other supplies were lacking. They didn't have trucks and transportation. They were really, at that point in time, in no shape to withstand an attack by the Japanese or anyone else.
On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese Navy struck Pearl Harbor. That same day, massive Japanese attacks hit 3 other targets: the U.S. Army Heavy Bomber Base at Clark Field in the Philippines, British Hong Kong, and British Malaya. All 4 attacks occurred within hours of each other, and all without warning. The Japanese intended to capture the oil fields and mines of Southeast Asia. But first, they had to get the U.S. and the British out of the way.
About 9 o'clock in the morning, here came the 27 airplane, 9 in 3 groups, 3 groups of 9. People were so angry at these planes. They even threatened to blow the plane with their pistols and their bayonets. And I said, what? That's not what they taught us in the cavalry. But, well, you could understand.
Bombing continued for about maybe more than 30 or 40 minutes. And after that, there was a lull, there was silence. And then suddenly here comes the fighter planes. They started strafing everything. Strafing. There were so many casualties.
The Japanese bombers caught the American aircraft sitting on the ramps, being loaded with bombs, ammunition, and gasoline. The Japanese attack destroyed all of the B-17 bombers and most of the P-40 fighter planes at Clark Field. The air crews were in the mess hall, grabbing a quick meal before takeoff. Some of the bombs landed directly on the mess hall.
Yung kumpanya namin, siyang napiling sumakoro doon sa mga Amerikanong binombahan. Nung pagdating namin doon sa kusina ng mga Army Air Corps, yung barracks nila at saka yung mess hall, ay wasak-wasak na. Ang mga puti ay maraming wounded. Nagdatingan yung mga ambulansya ng ospital ng Strasbourg. Ang dami ring namatay. Saka yung mga na-wounded na mga Amerikano.
General Douglas MacArthur, now in command of all U.S. forces in the Far East, assigned the Philippine Army to defend the beaches of Luzon. He held the U.S. Army's Philippine Scouts in reserve to use these better trained, better equipped soldiers as reinforcements in case the Philippine Army ran into trouble. The Japanese General Staff gave its commander, Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa, 50 days to defeat General MacArthur and capture the Philippines. He brought 80,000 well-equipped and well-trained troops to Luzon. He intended to defeat MacArthur by February 8, 1942. The Philippine Army tried to fight the Japanese on the beach at Lingayen Gulf, but the frontline men were poorly equipped and had not even completed their training. They were decimated by Japanese naval gunfire, tanks, and bombers. General MacArthur had to strengthen the front line before the Japanese broke through and headed south to capture Manila. He ordered the U.S. Army's 26th Cavalry, Philippine scouts to move up and reinforce the Philippine Army. By 5 a.m., the scouts were on their way.
On the 11th of December, we were alerted to go north. And that was the time that we were going to meet the enemy. And the Japanese airplanes were watching us because the 26th Cavalry was a big target. They can see the horses. So we have to stop on towns and then march again, stop, march, until we got to about 7 miles from the target objective at the Lingayen Gulf.
There were about 80 transports spread all over Lingayen Gulf.
43,000 Japanese soldiers were already ashore at Lingayen Gulf when the 800 scouts of the 26th Cavalry moved up to reinforce the Philippine Army's line.
We could see them, the ships, and there was no activity except the airplane. They were attacking us. And when we were trying to get in position to protect our area on both sides of the highway, the naval guns started firing, the artillery started firing, and here comes the tanks coming in, and we were being attacked from the air. So we fought from about noon to about maybe 4 o'clock. And then here comes the word for retreat.
We will be overwhelmed. So they took away the first squadron. They ordered them to withdraw. And my troop was the rear guard that day. And then the tanks came down, and we were left behind over there, and they burned the bridge.
General MacArthur ordered his army to fall back from Lingayen Gulf to the Bataan Peninsula. He directed his field commander, General Jonathan Wainwright, to execute the most dangerous military maneuver: withdrawal under fire. Wainwright set a series of delay lines, each 1 day's march from the last. He told the Philippine Scouts' 26th Cavalry they had to hold back the attacking Japanese at each delay line, while the Philippine Army infantry marched to the next line. The cavalrymen would then jump on their horses and ride for the next line to join the infantrymen. The scout cavalrymen in the Philippine Army were easy targets in the open plains of central Luzon. Each time they moved, they were attacked by Japanese bombers, fighter planes, and artillery. The men had to get to Bataan, the U.S. Army's stronghold in the Philippines, a fortified peninsula surrounded by water on 3 sides and covered by heavy jungle. Bataan's rugged terrain could protect the men from Japanese artillery, and the tall, thick trees would hide them from bombers and aerial observation. The 26th Cavalry had to hold the Japanese back.
Well, first thing, our mission is to delay the enemy so that everybody could assemble at Bataan as the main purpose. And we ended up having a poor encounter with the Japanese by just delaying.
They gave us the order to retreat to Rosario on the way to Pangasinan to have another line, form another defense line. But we were not able to because the Japanese were already on the city of Rosario where we were supposed to retreat. But they asked for the tanks to protect us. So while the tanks were firing against the Japanese, we went through Rosario on gallop. And then we waited for orders to get ready for another defense line. And on our side were 2 Philippine divisions. I think there were 3 Philippine divisions. They retreated without telling us because there was no communication. And what happened is we were left fighting.
In Rosario, there was a big fight. The order was, all this, at all costs, So you know what that means. But we could no longer hold it because we are all under pressure. So we withdrew to Season, cutting off one of our units, the Troop C.
General Wainwright came in, who was commander of North Luzon Force, our commander. He was looking for the Philippine Army Division, and they left. So he was so furious, so he gave the orders for us to retreat. So we retreated by bounds, and there were, I think, 4 or 5 delay lines that we have to protect alternately, while retreating. So in other words, we were holding the Japanese until we got into Bataan.
The cavalrymen held off the Japanese at each delay line, sometimes supported by tanks, sometimes on their own. At times, the Philippine Army held the Japanese back while the cavalrymen rested. But amid the bombing, there was confusion at all levels.
Just about maybe 5 meters above the horizon is the sun setting, and here it came. Pam, 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 pam. And then a lot more. And then when the sun went down, here is a lot more, just like Chinese New Year. My orders were to hold the line. So I inspected my line. I said, don't fire until I said we could see them. On my left are 9 heavy machine guns, Philippine Army machine gun, without nobody but 2 kids, huddling in the foxhole over there with their machine guns. And then we started to fire. One of them boys, one of them gunners, oh God, God, come help us, God. And then he paused. And then he says, they are killing us. He says, but please, God, come and help us. We stopped the Japanese over there. Nobody was able to come through. And after that firefight, when everybody was calm, everything was calm, I told Lasso. Lasso was my intelligence. I said, Lasso, I said, bring one of the boys. I said, look down in the bank, the riverbed, and find out why there is no more firing. And when he came back, I says, Sergeant, he says, they are all dead.
To escape the Japanese planes, General Wainwright ordered the Scouts' 26th Cavalry into the jungle-covered mountains north of Bataan.
The last town going to Bataan from Pampanga, we went up to the mountains. That's where we were ordered to go. When we reached Bataan, it was about January 8. So we found out we were one of the last unit to enter Bataan.
The Philippine Scouts' 26th Cavalry started out with 802 men and officers. Less than 400 arrived in Bataan. In 28 days of heavy fighting, the 26th Cavalry lost half its men.
And there just weren't enough scouts to defeat that force of well-trained Japanese soldiers. The 26th Cavalry Philippine Scouts did a magnificent job of delaying the Japanese.
We just volunteered to die, I think. That's what happened. If not for us, those Japanese are just going through the highway and maybe be in Manila almost maybe 1 or 2 days without us. But we complete the mission though.
General MacArthur ordered his commanders to hold the Japanese back for one more day at a temporary defense line across the north end of Bataan Peninsula. Philippine scouts from the U.S. Army's 23rd and 88th Field Artillery Regiments lined up their 75mm guns behind the Culo River. Next to them, the Philippine Army's 71st Field Artillery laid in its own 75mm guns. Scout forward observers climbed into tall trees where they could direct the artillery fire. They waited for the Japanese.
MacArthur always thought that the artillery was one of the best weapons that he had in support of the ground troops.
Sa Hermosa, Police. Doon naman pinesto namin yung mga kanyon namin. Ngayon, doon kami, mga ilan araw lang, dumating na nga punto, doon kami napalaban.
The lead elements of the Japanese force came into view, walking down the highway into Bataan. Once they were within range, the scout artillery fired direct hits on the highway itself. Startled Japanese soldiers dropped, mortally wounded. Those who were not hit dove into ditches. The Japanese artillerymen pulled their own guns off the road onto hard, flat farm fields, laid their cannons, and returned fire. Soon they were joined by long-range 150mm guns, guns that could hit the scouts' positions while the Japanese artillery stayed out of range of the scout artillery. Japanese spotter planes directed the fire from overhead. The counter-battery fire decimated the scout artillerymen. Japanese shells crashed into their positions, hit their cannons, and wiped out entire gun crew. At the height of the artillery battle, a Philippine scout mess sergeant, Sergeant Jose Calugas of the 88th Field Artillery, saw his battalion's guns knocked out of action and the gun crews killed by Japanese fire. While artillery shells exploded all around him, Calugas spotted a gun that looked like it was still usable and ran more than 1,000 yards across an open field through enemy fire. He rallied a crew of volunteers, and they turned the cannon on the oncoming Japanese. They blew holes through the Japanese lines. They saved the battery from being overrun. For his action and his heroism, the President of the United States awarded Sergeant Jose Calugas the Congressional Medal of Honor. It was the first action by a U.S. Army soldier in World War II to be recognized with the Congressional Medal of Honor.
We were being fired at by Japanese artillery until all of a sudden everything stopped. That's where Joe Calugas Sr. was able to do damage to the Japanese artillery.
The artillery battle was devastating. The Japanese artillery destroyed so much U.S. equipment and killed so many men that the artillery battle at Layak Junction was the most costly battle of the withdrawal into Bataan. But the artillerymen held back the Japanese advance for one more day. That gave the Philippine Army and the Philippine Scouts 57th Infantry time to dig in on General MacArthur's main line of defense, the Aboukay Line. General MacArthur's main line of defense ran from Aboukay Hacienda on the east side of the peninsula to Morong on the west side. The Philippine Army was still using bolt-action rifles. But before the Japanese attack, the U.S. Army issued new M1 Garand semi-automatic rifles to the Philippine Scouts. They were the first soldiers to use the M1 in combat. They were legendary marksmen, and the M1 gave the Scouts a huge advantage over the Japanese. Other weapons did not work so well. More than half their mortar rounds, leftovers from World War I, were duds. Hand grenades and anti-tank rounds were old and in short supply. Officers instructed the men to make Molotov cocktails out of glass bottles and gasoline. The fight at the Aboukay Line would be the first test for the Philippine Scouts' 57th Infantry.
The first fight that the Scouts had with the Japanese head-to-head was on the Bataan Peninsula at the mouth of the Manila Bay. And at that point, the scouts were disposed so as to prevent the Japanese from getting into Bataan.
With the M1 rifle, a scout could fire 8 shots without taking his finger off the trigger. They mowed down the attacking Japanese. At times, Japanese bodies piled 3 deep in front of the scouts' positions. But the Japanese kept coming. They leapt and crawled over the bodies of their fallen comrades in a furious banzai attack. Eventually, after hours of bloodshed and hundreds of losses, the surprised Japanese broke off their attack and pulled back. The scouts, alongside the Philippine Army, held the Japanese back. Nevertheless, after 3 more days of intense combat, Japanese attacks, heavy bombers, and fresh reinforcements drove a deep wedge into the scouts' line.
My uncle was a Philippine scout in the early part of the war.
Lieutenant Alexander Nininger of the 57th Infantry, Philippine Scouts, asked for volunteers to go into the Japanese-infested jungle to drive the enemy out. 10 Filipino scouts volunteered. Nininger led them in.
He came back for ammunition and went back with 3 Filipinos, all the while trying to clear this area and dealing with snipers that were in trees and were in foxholes.
Nininger came back